Hello everyone, and welcome to our adult story time. Today we're reading Armageddon 2419 AD by Phillip Francis Nowlan. This story is about Anthony Rogers, who was rendered unconscious in 1927 and awoke in the 25th century. So the setup for this is that he worked for the American Radioactive Gases Corporation, and he was sent to investigate some unusual phenomena that was happening in an abandoned coal mine in Wyoming Valley, Pennsylvania. He found the radioactive gases, and he was involved in a cave-in. So the radioactive gases preserved him for 500 years until the earth shifted and fresh air came back down to where he was caved in at. Then he clawed his way to the surface, and off he went into the 25th century. So we're starting at chapter 1, and this is when he first meets another human being of the 25th century. So let's begin, shall we? Chapter 1, Floating Men. My first glimpse of a human being of the 25th century was obtained through a portion of woodland, where the trees were thinly scattered, with a dense forest beyond. I had been wandering along aimlessly, and hopelessly musing over my strange fate, when I noticed a figure that cautiously backed out of the dense growth across the glade. I was about to call out joyfully, but there was something furtive about the figure that prevented me. The boy's attention, for it seemed to be a lad of 15 or 16, was centered tensely on the heavy growth of trees from which he had just emerged. He was clad in rather tight-fitting garments entirely of green, and wore a helmet-like cap of the same color. High around his waist he wore a broad, thick belt, which bulked up in the back across the shoulders into something of the proportions of a knapsack. As I was taking in these details, there came a vivid flash and a heavy detonation, like that of a hand grenade, not too far to the left of him. He threw up an arm and staggered a bit in a queer, gliding way. Then he recovered himself and slipped cautiously away from the place of the explosion, crouching slightly and still facing the denser part of the forest. Every few steps he would raise his arm and point into the forest with something he held in his hand. Wherever he pointed there was a terrific explosion, deeper in among the trees. It came to me that he was shooting with some form of pistol, though there was neither flash nor detonation from the muzzle of the weapon itself. After firing several times, he seemed to come to a sudden resolution, and, turning in my general direction, leaped, to my amazement, sailing through the air between the sparsely scattered trees in such a jump as I had never in my life seen before. That leap must have carried him a full 50 feet, though at the height of his arc he was not more than 10 or 12 feet from the ground. When he alighted, his foot caught in a projecting root, and he sprawled gently forward. I say gently, for he did not crash down as I expected him to do. The only thing I could compare it with was a slow-motion cinema, although I had never seen one in which horizontal motions were registered at a normal speed, and only the vertical motions were slowed down. Due to my surprise, I suppose my brain did not function with its normal quickness, for I gazed at the prone figure for several seconds before I saw the blood that oozed out from under the tight green cap. Regaining my power of action, I dragged him out of sight back of the big tree. I busied myself in an attempt to staunch the flow of blood. The wound was not a deep one. My companion was more dazed than hurt. But what of the pursuers? I took the weapon from his grasp and examined it hurriedly. It was not unlike the automatic pistol to which I was accustomed, except that it apparently fired with a button instead of a trigger. I inserted several fresh rounds of ammunition into its magazine from my companion's belt as rapidly as I could, for I soon heard, near us, the suppressed conversation of his pursuers. There followed a series of explosions round about us, but none very close. They evidently had not spotted our hiding place, and were firing at random. I waited tensely, balancing the gun in my hand, to accustom myself to its weight and probable throw. Then I saw a movement in the green foliage of a tree not far away, and the head and face of a man appeared. Like my companion, he was clad entirely in green, which made his figure difficult to distinguish, but his face could be seen clearly. It was an evil face, and had murder in it. That decided me. I raised the gun and fired. My aim was bad, for there was no kick in the gun, as I had expected, and I hit the trunk of the tree several feet below him. It blew him from his perch like a crumpled bit of paper, and he floated down to the ground, like some limp, dead thing, gently lowered by an invisible hand. The tree, its trunk blown apart by the explosion, crashed down. There followed another series of explosions around us. These guns we were using made no sound in the firing, and my opponents were evidently as much at sea as to my position as I was to theirs. So I made no attempt to reply to their fire, contenting myself with keeping a sharp lookout in their general direction. And patience had its reward. Very soon, I saw a cautious movement in the top of another tree. Exposing myself as little as possible, I aimed carefully at the tree trunk and fired again. A shriek followed the explosion. I heard the tree crash down, then a groan. There was silence for a while. Then I heard a faint sound of boughs swishing. I shot 3 times in its directions, pressing the button as rapidly as I could. Branches crashed down where my shells had exploded, but there was no body. Then I saw one of them. He was starting one of those amazing leaps from the bough of one tree to another, about 40 feet away. I threw up my gun impulsively and fired. By now I had gotten the feel of the weapon, and my aim was good. I hit him. The bullet must have penetrated his body and exploded. For one moment I saw him flying through the air, then the explosion, and he had vanished. He never finished his leap. It was annihilation. How many more of them there were, I don't know. But this must have been too much for them. They used a final round of shells on us, all of which exploded harmlessly, and shortly after I heard them swishing and crashing away from us through the treetops. Not one of them descended to earth. Now I had time to give some attention to my companion. She was, I found, a girl and not a boy, despite her bulky appearance, due to the peculiar belt strapped around her body, high up under the arms. She was very slender and very pretty. There was a stream not far away, from which I brought water and bathed her face and wound. Apparently the mystery of these long leaps, the monkey-like ability to climb from bough to bough, and of the bodies that floated gently down instead of falling, lay in the belt. The thing was some sort of anti-gravity belt that almost balanced the weight of the wearer, thereby tremendously multiplying the propulsive power of the leg muscles and the lifting power of the arms. When the girl came to, she regarded me curiously as I did her, and promptly began to quiz me. Her accent and intonation puzzled me a lot, but nevertheless we were able to understand each other fairly well, except for certain words and phrases. I explained what had happened while she lay unconscious, and she thanked me simply for saving her life. "You are a strange exchange," she said, eyeing my clothing quizzically. Evidently she found it mirth-provoking by contrast with her own neatly efficient garb. "Don't you understand what I mean by exchange? I mean, let me see. A stranger, somebody from some other gang. What gang do you belong to?" She pronounced it gang, with only a suspicion of a nasal sound. I laughed. "I'm not a gangster," I said, but she evidently did not understand this word. "I don't belong to any gang," I explained, and never did. "Does everybody belong to a gang nowadays?" "Naturally," she said, frowning. "If you don't belong to a gang, where and how do you live? Why have you not found and joined a gang? How do you eat? Where do you get your clothing?" "I've been eating wild game for the past 2 weeks," I explained, "and this clothing, I paused, wondering how I could explain that it must be many 100 years old. In the end, I saw that I would have to tell my story as well as I could, piecing it together with my assumptions as to what had happened. She listened patiently, incredulously at first, but with more confidence as I went on. When I had finished, she sat thinking for a long time. "That's hard to believe," she said, "but I believe it." She looked me over with frank interest. "Were you married when you slipped into unconsciousness down in that mine?" she asked me suddenly. I assured her that I had never married. "Well, that simplifies matters," she continued. "You see, if you were technically classed as a family man, I could take you back only as an invited exchange, and I, being unmarried and no relation of yours, couldn't do the inviting. Chapter 2. The Forest Gangs. She gave me a brief outline of the very peculiar social and economic system under which her people lived. At least it seemed very peculiar from my 20th century viewpoint. I learned with amazement that exactly 492 years had passed over my head as I lay unconscious in the mine. Wilma, for that was her name, did not profess to be a historian, and so could give me only a sketchy outline of the wars that had been fought and the manner in which such radical changes had come about. It seemed that another war had followed the First World War, in which nearly all the European nations had banded together to break the financial and industrial power of America. They succeeded in their purpose, though they were beaten, for the war was a terrific one, and left America, like themselves, gasping, bleeding, and disorganized, with only the hollow shell of a victory. This opportunity had been seized by the Russian Soviets, who had made a coalition with the Chinese to sweep over all Europe and reduce it to a state of chaos. America, industrially geared to world production and the world trade, collapsed economically, and there ensued a long period of stagnation and desperate attempts at economic reconstruction. But it was impossible to stave off war with the Mongolians, who by now had subjugated the Russians and were aiming at a world empire. In about 2109, it seems, the conflict was finally precipitated. The Mongolians, with overwhelming fleets of great airships and the science that far outstripped that of crippled America, swept in over the Pacific and Atlantic coasts and down from Canada, annihilating American aircraft, armies, and cities with their terrific disintegrator rays. These rays were projected from a machine not unlike a searchlight in appearance, the reflector of which, however, was not material substance, but a complicated balance of interacting electronic forces. This resulted in a terribly destructive beam. Under its influence, material substance melted into nothingness, i.e., into electronic vibrations. It destroyed all then known substances, from air to the most dense metals and stone. They settled down to the establishment of what became known as the Han Dynasty in America, a sort of a province in their world empire. Those were terrible days for the Americans. They were hunted like wild beasts. Only those survived who finally found refuge in mountains, canyons, and forests. Government was at an end among them. Anarchy prevailed for several generations. Most would have been eager to submit to the Hans, even if it meant slavery, but the Hans did not want them, for they themselves had marvelous machinery and scientific process by which all difficult labor was accomplished. Ultimately, they stopped their active search for and annihilation of the widely scattered groups of now savage Americans. So long as they remained hidden in their forests and did not venture near the cities the Hans had built, little attention was paid to them. Then began the building of the new American civilization. Families and individuals gathered together in clans or gangs for mutual protection. For nearly a century they lived a nomadic and primitive life, moving from place to place in desperate fear of the casual and occasional Han air raids and the terrible disintegrator ray. As the frequency of these raids decreased, they began to stay permanently in given localities, organizing upon lines which in many respects were similar to those of the military households of the Norman feudal barons, except that instead of gathering together in castles, their defense tactics necessitated a certain scattering of living quarters for families and individuals. They lived virtually in the open air, in the forests, in green tents, resorting to camouflage tactics that would conceal their presence from air observers. They dug underground factories and laboratories, that they might better be shielded from the electrical detectors of the Hans. They tapped the radio communication lines of the Hans, with crude instruments at first, better ones later on. They bent every effort toward the redevelopment of science. For many generations, they labored as unseen, unknown scholars of the Hans, picking up their knowledge piecemeal as fast as they were able to. During the early part of this period, there were many deadly wars fought between the various gangs, and occasional courageous but childishly futile attacks upon the Hans, followed by terribly punitive raids. But as knowledge progressed, the sense of American brotherhood redeveloped. Reciprocal arrangements were made among the gangs over constantly increasing areas. Trade developed to a certain extent, as between one gang and another. but the interchange of knowledge became more important than that of goods, as skill in the handling of synthetic processes developed. Within the gang, an economy was developed that was a compromise between individual liberty and military socialism. The right of private property was limited practically to personal possessions, but private privileges were many and sacredly regarded. Stimulation to achievement lay chiefly in the winnings of various kinds of leadership and prerogatives, and only in a very limited degree in the hope of owning anything that might be classified as wealth, and nothing that might be classified as resources. Resources of every description for military safety and efficiency belonged as a matter of public interest to the community as a whole. In the meantime, through these many generations, the Hans had developed a luxury economy, and with it the perfection of gilded vice and degradation. The Americans were regarded as wild men of the woods, and since they neither needed nor wanted the woods or the wild men, they treated them as beasts and were conscious of no human brotherhood with them. As time went on, and synthetic processes of producing foods and materials were further developed, less and less ground was needed by the Hans for the purposes of agriculture. And finally, even the working of mines was abandoned when it became cheaper to build up metal from electronic vibrations than to dig them out of the ground. The Han race, devitalized by its vices and luxuries, with machinery and scientific processes to satisfy its every want, with virtually no necessity of labor, began to assume a defensive attitude towards the Americans. And quite naturally, the Americans regarded the Hans with a deep, grim hatred. Conscious of individual superiority as men, knowing that latterly they were outstripping the Hans in science and civilization, they longed desperately for the day when they should be powerful enough to rise and annihilate the invaders that lay over the continent. At the time of my awakening, the gangs were rather loosely organized, but were considering the establishment of a special military force, whose special business it would be to harry the Hans and bring down their airships whenever possible, without causing general alarm among the Mongolians. This force was destined to become the nucleus of the national force when the day of retribution arrived. But that, however, did not happen for 10 years, and is another story. Wilma told me she was a member of the Wyoming gang, which claimed the entire Wyoming Valley as its territory under the leadership of Boss Hart. Her mother and father were dead, and she was unmarried, so she was not a family member. She lived in a little group of tents known as Camp 17, under a woman camp boss, with 7 other girls. Her duties alternated between military or police scouting and factory work. For the 2-week period which would end the next day, she had been on air patrol. This did not mean, as I first imagined, that she was flying, but rather that she was on the lookout for Han ships over this outlying section of the Wyoming territory, and had spent most of her time perched in the treetops scanning the skies. Had she seen one, she would have fired a drop flare several miles off to the side, which would ignite when it was floating vertically towards the earth, so that the direction or point from which it had been fired might not be guessed by the airship, and bring a blasting play of the disintegrator ray into her vicinity. Other members of the air patrol would send up rockets on seeing hers, until finally a scout equipped with an ultraphone, which, unlike the ancient radio, operated on the ultronic ethereal vibrations which passed the warnings simultaneously to the headquarters of the Wyoming gang and other communities within a radius of several hundred miles, not to mention to the few American rocket ships that might be in the air, and which instantly would duck to cover either through forest clearings or by flattening down to earth in green fields, where their coloring would probably protect them from observation. The favorite American method of propulsion was known as rocketing. The rocket is what I would describe, from my 20th century comprehension of the matter, as an extremely powerful gas blast, atomically produced through the stimulation of chemical action. Scientists of today regard it as a childishly simple reaction, but by that very virtue most economical and efficient. But tomorrow, she explained, she would go back to work in the cloth plant, where she would take charge of one of the synthetic processes by which those wonderful substitutes for woven fabrics of wool, cotton, and silk are produced. At the end of another 2 weeks, she would be back on military duty again, perhaps at the same work, or perhaps as a contact guard, on duty where the territory of the Wyomings merged with that of the Delawares, or the Susquehannas, or one of the half-dozen other gangs in that section of the country, which I knew as Pennsylvania and New York states. Wilma cleared up for me the mystery of those flying leaps which she and her assailants had made, and explained in the following manner how the inertian belt balances weight. Jumpers were in common use at the time I awoke, though they were very costly, for at that time inertian had not been produced in very great quantity. They were very useful in the forest. They were belts, strapped high under the arms, containing an amount of inertian adjusted to the wearer's weight and purposes. In effect, they made a man weigh as little as he desired, 2 pounds if he liked. Floaters are a later development of jumpers. Rocket motors encased in inertian blocks and strapped to the back in such a way that the wearer floats, when drifting, facing slightly downward. With his motor in operation, he moves like a diver, head foremost, controlling his direction by twisting his body and by movements of his outstretched arms and hands. Ballast weights locked in the front of the belt adjust weight and lift. Some men prefer a few ounces of weight in floating, using a slight motor thrust to overcome this. Others prefer a buoyancy balance of a few ounces. The inadvertent dropping of weight is not a serious matter. The motor thrust always can be used to descend. But as an extra precaution, in case the motor should fail for any reason, there are built into every belt a number of detachable sections, one or more of which can be discarded to balance off any loss in weight. But who were your assailants, I asked, and why were you attacked? Her assailants, she told me, were members of an outlaw gang referred to as Bad Bloods, a group which for several generations had been under the domination of conscienceless leaders who tried to advance the interests of their clan by tactics which their neighbors had come to regard as unfair, and who in consequence had been virtually boycotted. Their purpose had been to slay her near the Delaware frontier, making it appear that the crime had been committed by Delaware scouts, and thus embroil the Delawares and Wyomings in acts of reprisal against each other, or at least cause suspicions. Fortunately, they had not succeeded in surprising her, and she had been successful in dodging them for some 2 hours before the shooting began, at the moment when I arrived on the scene. But we must not stay here talking, Wilma concluded. I have to take you in, and besides, I must report this attack right away. I think we had better slip over to the other side of the mountain. Whoever is on that post will have a phone, and I can make a direct report. But you'll have to have a belt. Mine alone won't help much against our combined weights, and there's little to be gained by jumping heavy. It's almost as bad as walking. After a little search, we found one of the men I had killed, who had floated down among the trees some distance away, and whose belt was not badly damaged. In detaching it from his body, it nearly got away from me and shot up in the air. Wilma caught it, however, and though it reinforced the lift of her own belt so that she had to hook her knee around a branch to hold herself down, she saved it. I climbed the tree, and with my own weight added to hers, we floated down easily. So, those are the first 2 chapters of Armageddon 2419 AD by Phillip Francis Nowlan. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you join us again next time.